In the 1970s, a grave marker was stolen from the Aurora Cemetery in Aurora, Texas. The marker was replaced with a facsimile, and that too was stolen decades later in 2012. A large stone now marks the spot, directly beneath the tree. It's a tranquil setting in a tranquil town. But why steal a grave marker? The marker was unique in that it didn't have a name on it, nor a date of death. It had on it a very crude etching of what appeared to be a saucer-shaped craft with windows. You see, in 1897, the small town of Aurora, Texas, had a very strange encounter with Ned the alien. Early in the morning of April 19, 1897, a young boy helped his dad tend to their cattle. Charlie Stevens was 10 years old at the time, and at first there was nothing especially interesting or peculiar about that morning. He was looking forward to finishing up what they had to do so that he could have breakfast. And suddenly, his dad stopped what he was doing and looked toward the sky. Charlie stopped as well, and there, above them, passing overhead with a bright light and trailing smoke, was a cigar-shaped object. And Charlie had never seen anything like it, nor had his father. They watched as the object continued on toward Aurora until it dropped out of sight and exploded. Charlie, of course, wanted to go see what happened. They could get there pretty quickly on their horses, but not one to let his son shirk his duties. His dad said no, they had chores to finish up. They would find out what happened later. Charlie never forgot that morning, nor did he forget that his father went into town the next day to view the wreckage. Nor were they the only ones to see it. Others who saw this oddly shaped craft reported watching it sail slowly by at a speed of only 10 or 12 miles per hour, in apparent distress. Smoke billowed from the craft until it eventually flew low enough that a collision was inevitable. The collision happened after it had passed over the public square and made its way to the home of Judge Proctor. Judge Proctor owned a windmill and a water tank that was set on his property not too far from his house. The craft couldn't avoid it. It hit the windmill, exploded, and scattered metallic debris all over the judge's property. And those who rushed to the site to see what had happened and what the strange craft might have been were greeted with a grim discovery. That being a body. To hear them describe it, it wasn't like any body they had ever seen. It was small, disfigured, more likely than not from the crash itself, and of unknown origin. When they pulled the body away from the smoking debris, they discovered something else too. Papers. To add fuel to the mystery, the papers were indecipherable and composed of writing that could only be compared to some form of hieroglyphics. The metal from the craft was also of unknown origin and substance, and heavy. All in all, if one were to put it all back together, the craft must have weighed well over several tons. So, what powered it? That too was unknown. Whatever happened to it had set it on a collision course with Judge Proctor's windmill and into an article that appeared later that day in the Dallas Morning News. The article, written by reporter S.E. Hayden, described the event in detail. S.E. Hayden even ended his piece with the news that the pilot's funeral would be held the very next day at noon. So what about the pilot? There were opinions on that, too. A U.S. Signal Service officer by the name of T.J. Weems said that the pilot wasn't from Earth. Described as being an authority on astronomy, or whatever that means, Mr. Weems concluded that the pilot had been from the planet Mars. Exactly why he picked Mars as the visitor's origin is anyone's guess, but needless to say, the town rallied around this conclusion and even gave the poor pilot a nickname. They called him Ned. and still do to this very day over 120 years later. Now, after giving Ned a proper Christian burial in a quiet corner of the cemetery, the town then had to do something with the wreckage. Some pieces were buried with Ned, and curious visitors had already come and picked souvenirs from the scattered piles that littered the ground around Judge Proctor's farm. And not knowing what to do with the rest of it, they had a unique idea. Why not gather up the debris and dump it into a well on the property? So that's exactly what they did. Every last bit of it. And then they resumed life, knowing that their town had a singular and rare pleasure of being home to the body of an alien visitor from Mars. 38 years later, the judge's property was purchased by Mr. Brawley Oates. Being a clever sort and wanting to make use of the well as a water source, he cleaned out the debris. Where it went is anybody's guess, but as a reward for his efforts, Mr. Oates reported that the contaminated well water caused him to suffer severe arthritis. And, to prevent anyone else from falling victim to waters polluted by bits of a Martian spaceship, he had the well covered over by a concrete slab in 1945. And for the next few decades, life in Aurora continued on at a leisurely pace. Not much else of interest commanded headlines, which isn't a bad thing. Ned's grave became a curiosity magnet, and one would be hard-pressed to find anyone, who had grown up in Aurora that didn't know of the legend or visit Ned's final resting place. At one point, an enterprising soul even gave it a once-over with a metal detector. And what did they find? Just as they'd expected and as the old stories told, alongside the body were hunks of metal, presumably from the aircraft. And then, the grave marker was stolen. That's not surprising considering the traffic that visited the grave over the years. What also went missing were the hunks of metal. Later metal detecting efforts revealed that it too had apparently disappeared, although the grave itself appeared undisturbed. To prove that grave markers are necessary and people's memories short, Ned's exact location in the cemetery was somehow forgotten. Metal detectorists even descended upon Judge Proctor's old property. What did they find? Nothing except a few old license plates, none of which came from the planet Mars. And the town itself even fielded numerous requests to exhume Ned's body. The general consensus was to let Ned rest in peace. Are we to believe the stories? That a vessel from another planet crashed into a windmill and that its sole occupant was buried in the town cemetery? Is it possible that the whole thing was a hoax made up by a board staff writer for the Dallas News? That would not explain the eyewitness accounts that matched the story, namely that something did pass overhead and that it did crash. And yes, there used to be a windmill on the old Proctor property. The windmill's base was found near the well site, which is in fact covered over. And of Ned's remains? It's hard to say, but an unmarked grave was discovered using ground-penetrating radar. The grave is located in a part of the cemetery containing stones from the same time period, that being the 1890s. And let's say that it all really happened just as described in the article and by the eyewitnesses. Could the craft that crashed have come from somewhere a little closer to home than the planet Mars? For starters, manned air balloons weren't unheard of. In fact, controlled flight had been around for at least a century. The French inventor Jean-Pierre Blanchard flew one across the English Channel in 1784. Now, almost 70 years later, another French innovator, Henri Giffard, would power his cigar-shaped balloon with a steam engine. Cigar-shaped. Interesting. Prior to the crash in Aurora, there had been sightings all over the country of cigar-shaped objects in the sky, especially in the Southwest. In fact, if you locate a copy of the very same edition of the Dallas News from April 19, 1897, you won't find just the story about the Aurora incident. You'll find almost an entire page of similar stories. Most weren't as colorful as the story of the crash, but there is one account from Greenville, Texas that's worth mentioning. Greenville is roughly 94 miles east of Aurora, and that morning's paper contained a report from resident C.G. Williams. On the night of April 17th, Mr. Williams was walking across a field when dazzling bright lights stopped him in his tracks. When his eyes adjusted, he found himself looking at an enormous, cigar-shaped object on the ground. He even spoke with its pilot, who asked that Mr. Williams not speak of it to anyone. The pilot went on to relate that he was an inventor from New York and had been working on perfecting his ship for years. Over the last 2 weeks, prior to being confronted in the field by Mr. Williams, the pilot explained that he had been making longer trips, which is how he ended up in Texas and was forced to land to make adjustments before taking off again. The man actually asked Mr. Williams to mail some letters for him and again made him promise not to tell anyone. Mr. Williams subsequently refused to give up the names on the letters or the address in New York, but it is funny that he promised not to say anything. That promise lasted less than 48 hours. Not only did he tell someone, he told his story to the paper. So, we could conclude that the Aurora crash was a test airship, perhaps the very same one that Mr. Williams saw in Greenville 2 nights before. He did include in his report that the pilot was accompanied by 2 assistants. But don't forget, Ned, our unfortunate alien, was alone. Perhaps there were many such tests by many different airship enthusiasts being conducted at the same time of the crash. Or maybe Ned was from another planet, an inventor himself who had perfected interplanetary travel, whose test flight brought him to Earth and a rendezvous with a windmill. Maybe. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help others to find the show. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find more information and references that went into this episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions for future episodes. And if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear it. Visit the contact page for information on submitting your story.
After knocking your city, save making show, I'm the solution of it.